Hi, so we're in Charlottesville, Virginia at the James Monroe House, and yesterday we were at Jefferson's Monticello, and I'm always interested in these sorts of things, partly because of what you learn, but I think often what's even more revealing is how they curate and present things. I think it gives you an idea of how sensibilities about history and so forth are at the time. And one of the things that I took away both from both of these things, although they're very different, um, is that at least among popular history and things that appeal to tourists, a um, a certain great man sense of history is still very much alive, and you can tell that because although they've made quite an effort to situate these figures in their time and their surroundings and so forth, a lot of these tours and exhibits and so forth really focus on the particularities and quirks and interests of these individuals, and although it's interesting, I want to offer something of a critique to the way there's this continued interest in great man history, because I think that often it has a way of obscuring our understanding of the past and therefore our understanding of how events are really made. So I want to try to offer three critiques here of this great man history that hopefully can evolve over time. I think one problem with great man history and focusing really on these individuals is that it, ironically enough, actually loses sight of why these men became popular great men in the first place. And if you think about it, especially when you're thinking about someone in elected office, or especially the highest levels of elected office, although they're interesting people in their own right, the reason why they became the leaders of a nation is not ultimately because of what made them different or unique, but I would argue it's really because of all the things that they shared in common with a larger collective. And so when you think about it in that sense, um, if you think about Jefferson or Monroe or whoever, at the end of the day, the reason they became president is because they probably shared some baseline level of commonalities or assumptions with any of their other contemporaries who, with a certain amount of luck or whatever else, uh, could have been there instead of them. So I think focusing on the things that they had in common with their time as opposed to their uniqueness may actually be more revealing. Number two is I think that when we focus on great men as individuals, there's a inevitably I think a certain sense of winners histories or a winner narrative that takes over. We focus on these people because they won for whatever reason. But if you think about it, it's actually often the losers of these periods that are in some ways more interesting. So take, for example, Jefferson. One of the things that he's praised for, correctly in my view, is because he was a champion of religious liberty. And yet, when you think about it, why is he known as a champion of religious liberty? It's not because he was the first one to think that there ought to be religious liberty. It just so happens that, unlike others, roughly around his time, maybe a little bit before or whatever, he was the guy who championed liberty, who, rather than getting thrown in some jail or being treated like a crazy uncle in the attic, he was championing this at a time when it became broadly acceptable and he got to lead a country. But if you're looking at, for example, the history of religious liberty or something, it may not be Jefferson who's actually the key here. It may be the long line of losers, either before him, after him, or contemporaneously. Um, and then I think the final point I would make is that part of why there's so much interest in these great men and so forth is because I think at some level, when people study them or think about them, we either see ourselves in them, or perhaps even more importantly, we get a glimpse of who we want to be, or who other people should strive to be like. Um, but one of the things we found in both of these tours is that even though they're ultimately portrayed positively, that you can see that they had a lot of flaws or issues. One common theme that we found, for example, was financial trouble, and the fact that in all their giving to the public, they often were a little bit less or caring or giving, or maybe they were more callous toward the people immediately in their orbit. And I would argue that this is perhaps something that to a certain degree is inevitable, that when you have people who are giving their lives to greater causes or some collective, often the people who pay the price are the people close to them. And I wonder if we're thinking about how to make society better and you know, the kind of role models we want people to have, although I think obviously these people contribute a great deal, maybe ultimately the people who we want to look up to in society and encourage are not actually these great figures, but it's more people who maybe focus a little bit more on the people around them and contribute there as opposed to these bigger causes.